At 0847 hours on May 27, 1942, Lieutenant Peter Voss of the Royal Tank Regiment saw a flash on the desert horizon. He was commanding a Crusader tank 2,300 meters from the German positions at Gazala, Libya. The flash was small, distant. It looked like a mirror reflecting sunlight. Then his tank exploded. The 80 mm armor-piercing round entered through the front glacis plate, which was supposed to stop anything the Germans could fire at this range. The shell traveled through the fighting compartment at 810 meters per second, killing the gunner and loader instantly. The round exited through the rear plate, leaving a hole the size of a dinner plate. Vaux was thrown from the turret by the impact. He landed 10 meters from the burning tank. He was alive. His crew wasn't. He looked back at the German positions. He could see the gun now, a long barrel on a cruciform mount, the distinctive profile of an 88 mm Flak gun. The Germans were using anti-aircraft guns against tanks. At ranges where British tank guns couldn't even reach the target, the 88 was punching through armor like paper. Vaux had been briefed about the 80 mm. British intelligence had warned that German forces in North Africa were employing Flak 18 and Flak 36 anti-aircraft guns in an anti-tank role. The briefings said the guns were extremely effective. The briefings didn't explain what it felt like to watch your tank explode from a gun you couldn't see, couldn't reach, and couldn't fight. The 80 mm fired again. Another British tank 400 meters to Vaux's right erupted in flames. The round had traveled 2,200 meters in approximately 3 seconds. The German gunner had aimed, fired, and scored a direct hit on a moving target at over 2 kilometers. That shouldn't have been possible. Tank guns in 1942 were considered effective at 600 or 800 meters. The 88 was killing tanks at nearly 3 times that range. Vaux crawled toward a depression in the sand. German machine gun fire was kicking up dust around him. He could hear more explosions behind him. The entire British attack was falling apart. Tanks were burning across the desert. The 80 mm guns were positioned in a defensive line, hull down behind sand berms, nearly invisible until they fired. Each gun was destroying British armor methodically, one tank at a time, at ranges where the British couldn't return effective fire. The attack had been planned as a standard armor assault. British forces would advance across open ground, close with the German positions, and destroy them with superior numbers. The plan assumed that British tanks could survive long enough to close the range and engage effectively. The plan didn't account for the 88 mm. The gun had been designed in 1928 as an anti-aircraft weapon. Germany needed a high-velocity gun capable of engaging aircraft at high altitudes. The Treaty of Versailles prohibited German rearmament, but Sweden had no such restrictions. German engineers working with Swedish company Bofors developed the gun outside Germany, then brought the design back when restrictions were lifted. The official designation was 8.8 cm Flak 18. Flak was an abbreviation for Fliegerabwehrkanone, aircraft defense gun. The weapon fired an 88 mm diameter shell weighing approximately 9 kilograms. Muzzle velocity was 810 meters per second with standard high-explosive ammunition, or 820 meters per second with armor-piercing rounds. The gun could fire at targets up to 8,000 meters altitude, with an effective ceiling of approximately 10,000 meters. The mounting was a cruciform platform with 4 outriggers that provided stability during firing. The gun could traverse 360 degrees and elevate from 3 degrees to plus 185 degrees. This wide range of motion allowed the gun to engage aircraft from any direction and at any altitude within range. The crew consisted of 11 men, a commander, 2 loaders, 2 fuse setters, 2 gunners, 1 for traverse, 1 for elevation, and 4 men to handle ammunition and operate the fire control system. The gun entered service with the Luftwaffe in 1933. It was an anti-aircraft weapon. It was supposed to shoot down enemy bombers. No one initially considered using it against ground targets. The gun was too large, too heavy, and too valuable for anything except air defense. Then came the Spanish Civil War. In 1936, Germany sent military forces to Spain to support nationalist forces under General Franco. The contingent included Flak 18 batteries for air defense. German forces in Spain encountered Soviet-supplied tanks operated by Republican forces. The German 37mm anti-tank gun, the Pak 35-36, was ineffective against Soviet T-26 and BT-5 tanks at anything except point-blank range. In November 1936, a German Flak battery commanded by Hauptmann von Rosen was positioned near Madrid when Republican tanks attacked. With no dedicated anti-tank weapons available, von Rosen ordered his 88mm guns lowered to horizontal and fired directly at the tanks. The results were devastating. The 80 Militaires armor-piercing rounds penetrated the Soviet tanks effortlessly at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The attack was stopped cold. German officers observed and took notes. The 80mm Flak gun could destroy any tank in service in 1936. The high velocity gave it exceptional penetration. The accuracy allowed engagement at long range. The flat trajectory meant that once zeroed, the gun could hit targets reliably without complex ballistic calculations. This was a dual-purpose weapon. It could engage aircraft when needed and ground targets when necessary. The Luftwaffe began training Flak crews in anti-tank tactics. Special armor-piercing ammunition was developed specifically for the anti-tank role. Doctrine was written for employing Flak batteries in ground combat. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, 80 mm guns were positioned to engage Polish bunkers and fortifications. The guns proved effective, destroying concrete emplacements that resisted other weapons. But the gun's reputation was made in France in 1940 and refined in North Africa in 1941-1942. Erwin Rommel commanded the 7th Panzer Division during the invasion of France. He understood combined arms warfare. He used artillery, tanks, and infantry together, coordinating their actions to maximize effectiveness. When his division encountered French heavy tanks that his own panzers couldn't penetrate, Rommel brought forward 88mm Flak batteries and used them in the anti-tank role. At Arras on May 21, 1940, British Matilda tanks attacked Rommel's division. The Matilda had armor up to 78 mm thick. German 37mm anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate it. Even the Panzer's 50mm guns struggled at range. The British tanks rolled forward, seemingly invulnerable. Rommel personally directed 88mm Flak guns into position. The guns opened fire at 200 meters. The first salvo destroyed 3 Matildas. The British attack faltered. The 80mm could penetrate the Matilda's armor at ranges where the British couldn't effectively return fire. 9 Matildas were destroyed by 88mm guns at Arras. The counterattack failed. When Rommel was sent to North Africa in February 1941 to command the Afrika Korps, he brought 88mm guns with him. The desert was perfect terrain for the weapon. Visibility was excellent. Ranges were long. There was minimal cover. A gun positioned on high ground could see and engage targets at extreme distances. Rommel developed tactics specifically for the 88 in desert warfare. The guns would be positioned in concealed locations with good fields of fire. They would hold fire until British tanks advanced into the kill zone. Then they would open fire simultaneously, destroying as many tanks as possible before the British could react and withdraw. The guns were typically positioned hull down, meaning only the barrel and upper shield were visible above ground level. The crew dug a pit for the gun, with sand berms providing protection. From a distance, the position was nearly impossible to see. The gun wouldn't be detected until it fired, and by then it was usually too late. British tank crews called them tank traps. A position would appear empty. British tanks would advance. Suddenly, 80mm guns would open fire from concealed positions, destroying tanks before the British could identify the threat. The survivors would retreat, often unable to even locate where the fire had come from. The psychological effect was severe. British tank crews knew that somewhere in the desert, invisible 80mm guns were waiting. They knew that at any moment, without warning, their tank could be hit by a round traveling faster than sound, fired from a gun they couldn't see, positioned at a range where they couldn't fight back. The stress was overwhelming. Lieutenant Vaux, lying in the sand watching his tank burn, understood the problem completely. The 88 had fundamentally changed desert warfare. British tactics assumed relatively equal engagement ranges. British and German tanks would approach each other, fire at ranges of 600 to 1,000 meters, and the battle would be decided by numbers, training, and skill. The 88 destroyed that assumption. German forces could engage British armor at 2,000+ meters, far beyond the effective range of British tank guns. British tanks had to advance across 1,000+ meters of open desert, while under fire from weapons they couldn't reach. By the time British tanks got close enough to return fire effectively, half of them had been destroyed. British commanders tried various solutions. Artillery bombardment before the advance was standard, but 88 mm positions were difficult to locate and well protected. Direct hits were required to knock them out, and that meant accurate observed fire, which gave away the observer's position. Airstrikes were effective when aircraft were available, but Luftwaffe fighters made daylight bombing dangerous. Infantry assault was possible but costly. An 88 mm position typically included machine guns and supporting infantry. Advancing across open desert on foot toward a prepared position was nearly suicidal. Some British units succeeded by attacking at night, but night operations in the desert were difficult to coordinate, and units often became disoriented. The most effective counter was combined arms. Artillery would suppress the 88 mm positions. Smoke would obscure their vision. Infantry would advance under cover of smoke. Tanks would move forward in short bounds, using terrain features for cover. Aircraft would strafe known gun positions. This worked, but it required coordination, resources, and time. Often British forces didn't have all three. The gun's technical specifications explained its effectiveness. The 88 Flak 18 fired several types of ammunition. High explosive rounds for aircraft had a time fuse that detonated the shell at a preset altitude, creating a fragmentation pattern that would damage aircraft. Armor-piercing rounds for ground targets had a solid steel penetrator with a ballistic cap to maintain velocity during flight. The armor-piercing round, designated Panzergranate 39, weighed 9.4 kilograms and had a muzzle velocity of 820 meters per second. At 500 meters range, it could penetrate 138 metri of armor plate angled at 30 degrees. At 1,000 meters, penetration was 124 mm. At 2,000 meters, it could still penetrate 89 mm of armor. For comparison, the British Crusader tank that Lieutenant Vaux was commanding had maximum armor thickness of 51 mm on the front glacis. The 88 mm could penetrate that at any combat range. The British Matilda II, with 78 mm of frontal armor, could be penetrated at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. Even the American M4 Sherman, which began arriving in North Africa in late 1942, had only 51 mm of frontal armor. The 88 could destroy it effortlessly. German tank guns in 1942 were less capable. The Panzer III carried a 50 mm gun that could penetrate approximately 60 mm of armor at 500 meters. The Panzer IV carried a short 75 mm gun designed for infantry support, not anti-tank work. Later versions got the long 75 mm gun that was much more effective, but in early 1942, German tanks often struggled against well-armored British tanks at range. The 80 mm gave German forces a weapon that could kill any Allied tank at any range. That advantage was enormous. Rommel exploited it ruthlessly. He would position 80 mm batteries in defensive positions and deliberately draw British attacks into them. British tanks would advance, thinking they were attacking panzer formations. They would run directly into concealed 80 mm guns and be destroyed. The Battle of Gazala in May-June 1942 demonstrated the 88's effectiveness perfectly. German forces established defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire. 80 mm guns were positioned to cover all approaches. British armor attacked repeatedly. Each attack ran into the 88 mm screen and was shot to pieces. On June 12, 1942, the British launched a major attack toward Knightsbridge. Approximately 100 British tanks advanced across open ground toward German positions. Hidden 80 mm guns opened fire at 1,800–2,200 meters. British tanks began exploding before they could identify the threat. The attack continued. British commanders believed the fire was coming from German tanks and ordered their units to close and engage. By the time British tanks got within effective range of German positions, over 40 had been destroyed or damaged. The survivors engaged German panzers at close range, but the damage was done. The 80mm guns had gutted the attack before British tanks could fight back. German tank losses were minimal. Similar engagements occurred throughout the North Africa campaign. At every major battle, Crusader, Gazala, 1st Alamein, Alam Halfa, the 88mm played a central role. British forces learned to identify 88mm positions and call in artillery or airstrikes before advancing. They learned to use terrain features to mask their approach. They learned that frontal attacks across open desert against prepared 88mm positions were suicide. But learning these lessons cost lives. Hundreds of British tanks were destroyed by 88mm guns in 1941 to 1942. Thousands of tank crew members were killed or wounded. Each engagement taught British forces something about how to fight the 88, but the education was expensive. The gun's crew training was extensive. Luftwaffe Flak units were considered elite. Crews trained for months on aircraft recognition, ballistic calculations, and gunnery. The training standards were high because the gun was complex and valuable. A trained 88mm crew represented a significant investment in time and resources. When the guns were used in the anti-tank role, the training paid off. The crews could calculate range and deflection quickly. They could adjust fire based on observation. They could load and fire rapidly. A well-trained crew could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute. The gun's accuracy at long range was excellent because the crews knew how to use it properly. The gun's maintenance requirements were significant. The barrel wore from firing and needed replacement after approximately 900 rounds. The recoil system required regular servicing. The traverse and elevation mechanisms needed lubrication. In desert conditions, sand got into everything and caused problems. German maintenance crews worked constantly to keep the guns operational. Ammunition supply was always a concern. Each 80mm round weighed approximately 15 kilograms. A basic load for one gun was 200 to 300 rounds. That meant 3,000 to 4,500 kilograms of ammunition per gun. Transporting this across the desert required trucks, which required fuel, which was always in short supply in North Africa. When ammunition ran low, guns had to be withdrawn or used sparingly. Despite these limitations, the 88mm was Rommel's most effective anti-tank weapon throughout 1941 to 1942. German intelligence estimated that 88mm guns were responsible for destroying more Allied tanks than all German panzers combined during this period. The exact numbers are disputed, but the 88's dominance was clear. The gun's effectiveness led to tactical changes on both sides. German forces began designing their defensive positions around 80mm and coverage. British forces began planning their attacks specifically to avoid 80mm engagement areas or to neutralize the guns before attacking. The weapon had become so important that entire battles were planned around it. In July 1942, at 1st Alamein, Rommel positioned his forces in a defensive line running from the Mediterranean coast to the Qattara Depression. The line was anchored by 88mm positions. Every likely British approach was covered by multiple guns. British attacks in July repeatedly struck this defensive line and were stopped cold. British Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery took command of 8th Army in August 1942. He studied the German defensive system carefully. He recognized that the 88mm was the key. Montgomery's plan for the Second Battle of Alamein in October 1942 specifically addressed the 88mm threat. Montgomery's artillery would conduct a massive bombardment before the infantry attack. The goal was to destroy or suppress 88mm positions. British artillery would fire over 1 million rounds in the opening bombardment. 88mm positions were priority targets. Forward observers would direct fire onto suspected gun locations. Infantry would attack at night when the 88's long-range advantage was negated by darkness. Engineers would clear paths through minefields. Tanks would follow only after infantry had secured the ground and identified 88mm positions. Airstrikes would hit German artillery throughout the battle. The plan worked. At Alamein in October-November 1942, British forces broke through German defensive lines despite the 88mm guns. The massive artillery bombardment knocked out many positions. Night attacks allowed British infantry to get close. When German forces attempted to counterattack, they ran into British anti-tank guns and were stopped. Rommel's forces, running low on fuel and ammunition, were forced to retreat. Even in defeat, the 80mm remained dangerous. As German forces retreated across Libya and Tunisia, 88mm guns provided rearguard fire, destroying pursuing British tanks and covering the withdrawal. When the Afrika Korps made stands at defensive positions, the 88mm was always at the center of the defense. The gun's success in North Africa led to its expanded use on other fronts. On the Eastern Front, 80mm guns were deployed against Soviet armor. The T-34 and KV-1 Soviet tanks had armor that German Pak-38 50mm anti-tank guns struggled to penetrate. The 80mm could destroy them at long range. At the Battle of Rostov in November 1941, German 80mm guns destroyed over 30 Soviet tanks in a single engagement. Soviet armored attacks ran into prepared 88mm positions and were shot to pieces. The guns were positioned in depth, so if Soviet tanks overran the first line, they encountered more 88s in the second and third lines. The psychological effect on Soviet tank crews was similar to what British crews experienced in North Africa. Soviet tankers knew that somewhere ahead, invisible 80mm guns were waiting. The knowledge that their tank could be destroyed at any moment from extreme range created tremendous stress. In Western Europe after D-Day, German forces used 88mm guns extensively in defensive fighting. The guns were positioned to cover roads, villages, and likely Allied advance routes. American and British forces learned quickly that advancing into 88mm fire was costly. Combined arms tactics became essential. American tank crews developed healthy respect for the 88. Veterans who fought in Northwest Europe consistently rated the 88mm as the most dangerous German anti-tank weapon. More dangerous than the Tiger tank's 88mm gun, more dangerous than the Panther's 75mm, the towed 88mm Flak gun was feared above all else because it was so hard to see before it fired. The gun was also used in a static defense role. When Germany fortified the Atlantic Wall before D-Day, 88mm guns were installed in concrete emplacements. The guns could engage ships offshore and aircraft overhead. On D-Day, some Allied landing craft and ships were hit by 88mm fire from shore batteries. But by 1944, the gun's vulnerability had become clear. The 88mm was large and relatively immobile. Moving the gun required a truck and took time. The gun was vulnerable to artillery fire. A single 155mm shell landing near the gun could destroy it and kill the crew. Airstrikes were extremely effective against 88mm positions. Most significantly, the Allies had learned how to fight the 88. Infantry would identify gun positions and call in artillery or airstrikes. Tanks would provide covering fire while infantry advanced. Smoke would obscure the 88's vision. Flanking attacks would force the gun to displace. The tactics weren't perfect, but they worked better than they had in 1942. German industry produced several variants of the 88mm gun. The Flak 18 was the original 1933 model. The Flak 36, introduced in 1936, had a simplified barrel construction that reduced manufacturing time. The Flak 37, introduced in 1939, had improved fire control instruments. The Flak 41, introduced in 1943, had increased muzzle velocity and sealing, but was complex and expensive. Total production of all 88mm Flak variants from 1933-1945 was approximately 20,000 guns. This was a substantial number, but it was never enough. German forces always needed more. The guns were issued to Luftwaffe Flak units for air defense, but they were constantly being diverted to ground combat roles where they were desperately needed. The gun was also adapted for use on vehicles. The WWII heavy tank, introduced in 1942, mounted an 88mm gun, designated WW2 This was essentially a flak gun modified for tank use. The weapon gave the Tiger exceptional firepower. No Allied tank in 1942 or 1943 could match the Tiger's combination of armor and gun. The Tiger's 80 meters could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, while Allied tank guns struggled to penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor even at close range. The Tiger's 88mm was derived from the Flak 36, but modified for tank use. The barrel was shortened slightly. The recoil system was adapted for the confined space of a tank turret. The gun still fired the same ammunition as the Flak gun. The penetration and range were similar. When Allied tank crews encountered Tigers, they faced the same problem they had faced with towed 88s in North Africa, outranged and outgunned. Later variants of the 80mm for tanks included the KWK-43 gun used on the Tiger II heavy tank. This weapon had even higher velocity and penetration. It could destroy any Allied tank at any range, but by the time the Tiger II entered service in 1944, Germany was losing the war. Superior Allied numbers, air power, and logistics overwhelmed German technological advantages. For the crews who operated the 88mm, the gun was both a blessing and a curse. The weapon gave them exceptional firepower. A well-positioned 88mm crew could dominate a battlefield, but the gun was also a priority target. Enemy forces would focus tremendous firepower on destroying 80mm positions. Many gun crews were killed by counter-battery artillery fire or airstrikes. The physical demands were significant. Each 80mm round weighed 15 kilograms. Loaders had to lift and load rounds continuously during combat. In sustained firing, this was exhausting. The gun's muzzle blast was powerful. Crews needed hearing protection or risked permanent damage. The recoil was violent. Anyone standing behind the gun when it fired could be injured. Operating in desert conditions was particularly difficult. Temperatures could exceed 50 degrees C. The gun's metal surfaces became too hot to touch. Sand got into mechanisms and caused malfunctions. Water was scarce. Crews suffered from dehydration, heat exhaustion, and sand-related illnesses. Maintenance was constant. The gun required daily cleaning to function reliably. On the Eastern Front, conditions were equally harsh in different ways. Winter temperatures could drop below 30 degrees C. Lubricants froze. Metal became brittle. Crews suffered from frostbite. The gun's mechanisms could freeze and fail. Snow and ice obscured visibility. Moving the gun in winter conditions was extremely difficult. Despite these challenges, 80mm crews maintained high morale throughout the war. The weapon gave them confidence. They knew they possessed one of the war's most effective guns. They took pride in their skill and training. Veterans of 88mm crews often spoke positively about the weapon in post-war interviews, even when discussing Germany's defeat. Allied forces that captured 88mm guns were impressed by the weapon's quality and design. The gun was well-engineered, robust, and effective. American ordnance officers examined captured 88s carefully. Reports noted the weapon's excellent ballistic performance, the quality of manufacture, and the thoughtful design details. Post-war, several nations continued using captured 88mm guns. Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern European countries operated 88s into the 1950s. The weapons were effective for air defense and anti-tank use for years after World War II ended. Some guns remained in service for training purposes into the 1960s. The 88mm influenced post-war weapon development significantly. The concept of a dual-purpose gun that could engage both air and ground targets became standard. Most modern anti-aircraft systems can engage ground targets when necessary. The 80mm proved the concept was practical. Tank guns also increased in caliber and performance after the war, partly in response to the 88's effectiveness. By the 1950s, most main battle tanks carried guns in the 90-105mm range, with high-velocity guns capable of long-range engagements. The trend toward larger, more powerful tank guns was driven partially by the lessons learned from the 88mm. For Lieutenant Peter Vaux, lying in the sand watching his tank burn on May 27, 1942, the gun's post-war influence was irrelevant. He was alive, his crew was dead, his tank was destroyed. The 88mm had done what it was designed to do, destroy enemy armor at long range. Vaux survived the war. He was captured by German forces shortly after his tank was destroyed and spent the remainder of the war in POW camps. He was liberated in 1945 and returned to Britain. He left the army and worked in business. He rarely discussed his war experiences. When he did, he always mentioned the 88 mm, the gun that destroyed his tank from a position he couldn't see, at a range where he couldn't fight back, with a single round that killed 2 of his friends instantly. That was the 88 mm's legacy, a weapon so effective that it traumatized an entire generation of Allied tank crews, a gun that forced tactical changes across multiple fronts, a design so successful that it influenced military thinking for decades. The 88 mm wasn't the biggest gun of World War II, or the most powerful, or the most numerous. But it might have been the most feared. And for good reason. When the flash appeared on the desert horizon, it was already too late. The round was already traveling downrange at 820 meters per second. By the time you saw the flash, the shell would hit approximately 3 seconds later if you were at 2,000 meters. There was no time to react, no time to take cover, no time to fire back. You just had to hope the German gunner missed. Usually, he didn't. The gun's effective range exceeded most tanks' range by 1,000+ meters. That gave German crews an enormous advantage. They could engage first, from positions of their choosing, at times of their choosing. They could destroy enemy armor before the enemy could even acquire the target. That's a decisive tactical advantage. That's why the 88 mm was so effective. That's why it was so feared. In the end, the 88 mm was defeated not by a better weapon, but by numbers and tactics. Allied forces learned to identify 88 mm positions and destroy them with artillery or airstrikes before attacking. They learned to use combined arms, infantry, armor, artillery, and air power working together. They learned to attack at night when the 88's range advantage disappeared. They learned to use smoke and terrain. They learned, but the lessons were expensive. Thousands of Allied tanks were destroyed by 88 mm guns during World War II. Exact numbers are difficult to determine, but post-war analysis suggests the 88 mm destroyed more tanks than any other single German weapon system. That's an extraordinary achievement for a gun that was originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, adapted for ground combat almost by accident, and never intended for the role where it proved most effective. The 88 mm Flak gun represents an important principle in military history. Weapons often prove most effective in roles they weren't designed for. The gun was created to shoot down bombers. It became legendary for destroying tanks. That happened because German officers recognized the weapon's potential and adapted it to meet battlefield needs. The weapon was available. The need existed. Creative tactical thinking made the connection. Modern military forces study the 80 mm as an example of weapons employment innovation. The gun itself was good, well-designed, powerful, accurate. But the tactical employment made it exceptional. Positioning, concealment, combined arms integration, these factors multiplied the weapon's effectiveness. A 88 mm gun on open ground without support was vulnerable. An 80 mm amateur gun in a prepared position with infantry support, positioned to cover likely enemy approaches, with ammunition and maintenance support, became nearly unstoppable. The crews made the difference too. A poorly trained crew with an 80 mm was less effective than a well-trained crew with an inferior weapon. German flak crews were extensively trained. They understood ballistics, range estimation, target leading, ammunition selection. They could service the gun, clear malfunctions, and adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The weapon was a tool. Skilled hands made it deadly. For the soldiers who faced the 88 mm in combat, technical analysis was abstract. They knew the gun could kill them from distances they couldn't comprehend. They knew that somewhere in the desert, or the Bocage, or the Eastern European plains, invisible 80 mm guns were sighted on their likely routes of advance. They knew that at any moment, without warning, their tank could be hit. That knowledge created a stress that never went away. Some crews developed rituals or superstitions to cope. Lucky charms, prayers, specific routines before entering combat. These didn't protect against the 88 mm, but they provided psychological comfort. Other crews became fatalistic. accepting that death could come at any moment and there was nothing they could do about it. Veterans described the feeling as helplessness, knowing you were vulnerable, knowing you might be killed, and knowing there was no defense. The sound of the 88mm firing became iconic. A sharp crack, louder than other guns, followed by the whistle of the shell in flight. Tank crews learned to recognize that sound. When they heard it, they knew an 88 was firing in their area. The reaction was instinctive: button up, increase speed, take evasive action. Often it was too late. The shell would hit before they could react. But the sound triggered survival instincts anyway. German propaganda exploited the 88mm's reputation. Newsreels showed the guns in action, destroying enemy tanks. The message was clear: German forces possessed superior weapons. German soldiers were better trained. German tactics were more effective. The propaganda wasn't entirely false. The 80mm was an exceptional weapon. But propaganda never mentioned the gun's vulnerabilities or limitations. It never showed 80mm positions destroyed by artillery. It never discussed the supply problems or the training casualties. Allied propaganda countered by emphasizing their own weapons and tactics. Training films taught soldiers how to identify 88mm positions and how to attack them. The message was that the 88 could be defeated. This was true, but the films made it seem easier than it actually was. Real combat against 88mm positions was difficult and dangerous. Many soldiers who watched the training films and then encountered real 88s discovered that reality was much harder than the films suggested. The gun's nickname varied by nationality. British forces called it the 88. American forces used the same name. Soviet forces called it Acht, 88, a transliteration of the German Acht. The nickname was simple and universal. Everyone knew what you meant when you said 88. It was the gun, the one that could kill you from beyond visual range. The one you couldn't fight, the one you couldn't hide from. Technical manuals captured after the war revealed interesting details about 88mm employment doctrine. German forces had detailed procedures for positioning guns, calculating firing data, and coordinating multiple guns in batteries. The manuals emphasized mutual support, guns covering each other's blind spots, positioning to create crossfires, using terrain to maximum advantage. The manuals also revealed the gun's limitations. The weapon was vulnerable during displacement, moving from one position to another. It took approximately 90 minutes for an experienced crew to prepare a new firing position, including digging, camouflaging, and registering targets. During this time, the gun couldn't fight. Crews were instructed to move only when necessary and to prepare alternate positions in advance. Ammunition resupply was critical. The gun fired approximately 15-20 rounds per minute in sustained combat. A basic load of 250 rounds could be exhausted in 15 minutes of intense firing. Resupply required trucks, which were vulnerable to air attack. German doctrine called for stockpiling ammunition at gun positions before combat, but this wasn't always possible. Crew casualties were a constant problem. A direct hit on an 80mm position killed the entire crew. Training replacements took months. Experienced gun commanders were especially valuable and difficult to replace. As the war progressed and German casualties mounted, crew quality declined. By 1944-1945, many 88mm positions were manned by crews with minimal training, reducing the gun's effectiveness significantly. Despite these problems, the 80mm remained formidable until the end of the war. In the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German forces used 80mm guns extensively in defensive positions. American tanks advancing through the Ardennes forest encountered 88s at close range and suffered heavy casualties. Even with air superiority and numerical advantage, American forces found 80mm positions difficult to overcome. In the final battles in Germany in 1945, isolated 88mm guns fought rearguard actions as German forces retreated. Individual guns positioned at crossroads or bridges could delay Allied advances for hours or days. The crew knew they would be destroyed eventually, but they fought anyway, destroying Allied vehicles and covering German withdrawals until they were overrun. The last 88mm gun fired in combat was probably in early May 1945, during the final days of the war in Europe. The location is unknown, the crew's fate is unknown. But somewhere in the ruins of Nazi Germany, an 88mm crew loaded their gun one final time, fired at an advancing Allied vehicle, and was probably destroyed shortly after by overwhelming firepower. For Lieutenant Peter Vaux, the 88mm remained vivid in memory for the rest of his life. He never forgot the flash on the horizon, the explosion, the feeling of being thrown from his tank, the sight of his vehicle burning, the knowledge that two of his friends had died instantly, the helplessness of facing a weapon he couldn't fight. That was the 88mm's true legacy, not the technical specifications or the kill counts, but the memories of the men who faced it, the fear it inspired, the tactical changes it forced, the losses it inflicted. The 88mm was more than just a gun. It was a symbol of German military capability at its peak, a weapon that demonstrated the importance of innovation, training, and tactical flexibility, a design that influenced military thinking for generations. When historians study World War II weapons, the 88mm Flak gun consistently ranks among the most significant, not because it was the most powerful or most numerous, but because it was used so effectively in a role it wasn't designed for, with devastating results. The gun proved that creative tactical thinking could transform a weapon's effectiveness. That lesson remains relevant today.